Stories from across India and the world. With me today from London is my colleague Julia Chapman. Good afternoon, Julia.
Good afternoon, Tanvi. It's 11:30 a.m. here in the UK and 12:30 p.m. across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, the EU makes a breakthrough on migration, Ukraine looks to recruit more troops, and a blow has come to Donald Trump ahead of next year's US presidential election. But first, the headlines.
Israel continues to battle Hamas as the United Nations Security Council delays vote on Gaza aid by another day. US says it's working with countries on the UN draft resolution. The European Union strikes a new deal on hosting and limiting migrants and asylum seekers more evenly. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi responds to allegations of an Indian assassination plot in the United States, says New Delhi will look into it, but India-US ties would not be derailed by few incidents. And a top court in US's Colorado disqualifies Donald Trump from the 2024 presidential primary election race. Up first, news from West Asia. The Israeli army on Wednesday released footage of airstrikes hitting what it said were Hamas targets in Gaza. Israeli Defense Force said that airstrikes were carried out on dozens of Hamas groups and their infrastructure in Gaza. The Israeli forces said a Hamas terrorist armed with a rocket-propelled grenade was targeted and killed in Khan Yunis. Residents of Khan Yunis reported intensifying gun battles between Hamas and Israeli forces in the center and eastern districts of the city. Meanwhile, thick smoke was seen over Gaza's skyline on Wednesday as intense clashes continue between Israeli troops and Hamas. Additionally, the Al-Quds Brigades, the armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement, released a video of two Israeli hostages, escalating tensions. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared the conflict won't cease until Hamas releases the 129 remaining hostages. Further, Israeli army's aircraft struck a series of Hezbollah targets in Lebanon on Wednesday. A video released by the Israeli army showed smoke billowing from what the Israeli army said were Hezbollah infrastructure and military sites. Israel and Hezbollah fighters have been trading fire along the frontier on a regular basis since the conflict in Gaza erupted more than 2 months ago. Now, the United Nations Security Council has delayed a vote on Gaza aid. Many UN members say that the move is vital to address the humanitarian situation in the enclave, but the US has expressed concerns that the text fails to sufficiently address Israeli security concerns. William Denslow reports from the UN headquarters.
The frustrating day at the United Nations as diplomats continue to wrangle over the language in a draft resolution on the situation in Gaza. Earlier this week, we saw this draft presented that had a call for the urgent suspension of hostilities to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access. But what we understand from reports is that the United States has had real issues with some of the language in this draft resolution and wants it watered down. It's understood that the draft included the phrase urgent steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities. It's understood that Washington has an issue with the reference to cessation of hostilities. So that has been a major stumbling block for diplomats at the United Nations. UN officials on Tuesday expressed the dire need for more humanitarian access into the Palestinian enclave. The UN estimates that around 85% of people in Gaza are now internally displaced. They warned that UN humanitarian groups working on the ground there are on the brink of collapse. UN officials say that the situation for civilians, they say that the impact has been unbearable for them, really imploring council members to come together and to pass a meaningful resolution to get more humanitarian access into the Gaza Strip and really try and see more protection of civilians going forward. We have heard on Tuesday from Robert Wood, who is the US Alternative Representative for Special Political Affairs. Now, he said to the press on Tuesday afternoon here in New York that efforts were continuing with other members of the Security Council to work on the draft text. He said, we'll see how discussions go. He says they're working on the issues and that we will see what happens. William Denslow in New York, reporting for DD India.
Meanwhile, the United States said that they are working with countries on the UN Security Council to resolve the outstanding issues related to this draft resolution.
We are engaging constructively with our colleagues on the Security Council to resolve outstanding issues related to that resolution. We fully support addressing the humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza, as this resolution should set out to do, and we're working through these issues with other countries on the Security Council.
On to Europe now. Representatives of the European Parliament and of EU governments reached an accord on Wednesday to handle migration and asylum applications. The aim is to limit the numbers of people coming in. My colleague Julia Chapman is in London. She gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Julia, after 3 years of bitter debates, EU finally striking a deal to reform its migration policy.
That's right, Tanvi. The European Parliament and member states struck a major deal on Wednesday to reform the bloc's migration policy. The pact focuses on screening irregular migrants when they arrive in the European Union, procedures for handling asylum applications, rules on determining which EU country is responsible for processing application, and ways to handle crises. The ultimate goal is to find a balance between the responsibility of frontline nations, including Italy, Greece and Spain, which receive the bulk of asylum seekers. European Commission Vice President Margarita Schinas says the deal takes into account every country's concerns.
With the agreement, we are introducing a new and mandatory screening at all borders of all arrivals. In a second stage, all those unlikely to get asylum will have to go through mandatory fast-tracked border procedures with streamlined procedures for dealing quickly with asylum claims and efficiently processing returns of those who have no legal reason to be under the European Union's protection. This system will create a seamless procedure at our external borders, which will ensure that people are quickly channeled to and through the right procedures at all times.
I'm joined now by DD India's Alex Cadier from Brussels. Alex, EU officials are calling this decision historic. Why is that?
Well, Julia, it's 8 years in the making. That gives you a sense of how difficult these negotiations have been, how very clearly tense those debates have been between those member states. It was a kind of a project of law that started off the back of the 2015 migration crisis here in Europe, where refugees and asylum seekers from the Middle East and Africa were fleeing war, trying to get in to Europe, and those crossings of the Mediterranean you saw in such huge numbers back in 2015, and we've seen that still in the last few years. And this is what this new agreement is trying to solve. The Migration Pact is trying to solve. They also are trying to balance out the burden borne by those member states. As you mentioned, Italy, Greece taking a lot more than their fair share. At least that's certainly how their governments feel. So it's been a very long and complicated process to get here, and also crucially, migration is one of the most fundamentally divisive issues of the European Union. It's one of the issues on which countries are furthest apart in their negotiating positions, and it's a deal that will really provide a framework that the EU hasn't had to deal with large numbers of migrants trying to come in through their borders. One issue that you mentioned is that those rejections will be easier to do at the point of entry. Member states will be able to send people back in a slightly expedited and easier fashion. The other issue, of course, is the redistribution of asylum seekers who are granted asylum in Europe, and at the moment that system is not in place. What this will do is put a system in place where they are evenly distributed around the member states in the European Union. Those who don't want to accept them will have to pay a fee of 20,000 euros per asylum seeker they do not accept. So certainly a historic moment for the EU with this new migration system being agreed.
And how much of a difference will these changes make on the ground?
Well, immediately they won't make much of a difference because there's still the next few legislative phases for the European Union. The Parliament needs to vote to ratify this proposed law, and then the member states have to rubber stamp and sign off before it can be implemented. Then it goes into a year at least of implementation, so it'll take a little bit of time to sit in. There are two clear issues where this will make a difference. One is obviously the processing of asylum claims, the rejecting of what the EU deems to be incorrect asylum claims, and that redistribution of refugees across the EU. That will have an impact for the member states. But also politically, this is a particularly big issue as we go into an election year for the European elections. We know that migration has been one of the more divisive issues. The rise of far-right parties in certain member states has been linked directly in their rhetoric to the surge in migration, and so certainly on a political level, this will give a little bit of respite to those very stark debates about migration here in Europe.
Thank you very much, Alex Cadier in Brussels. Moving on, British inflation has hit its lowest point in over 2 years, with the Consumer Prices Index dropping to 3.9% in November from 4.6% in October. Inflation fell in part because of lower petrol prices. This was the slowest rate of growth since September 2021. The country's finance minister, Jeremy Hunt, says the figure shows government efforts are making an impact.
Yeah, 11.1%. Now it's fallen to 3.9%, the lowest for over 2 years. And that shows the government's plan for the economy is working. But nonetheless, it is very tough for a lot of families. And that's why from next month, national insurance contributions will go down by 2%. That's worth £450 a year for someone on the average wage. And I hope that will make a difference to a lot of families up and down the country.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the military has asked for an additional 500,000 people to be mobilized into the army. At a news conference in Kyiv on Tuesday, the Ukrainian leader said conducting a mobilization at such a scale would require additional financing.
Their position on the General Staff meeting was that they proposed to mobilize an additional 450,000 to 500,000 people. This is a very serious number, and I said that I need more arguments to support this idea. This is a question about people, about justice, about defense capabilities, and a financial question.
DD India's Megumi Lim has more from Kyiv.
President Zelensky held a year-end press conference in Kyiv on Tuesday, where he said Ukraine's military had asked for an additional 450 to 500,000 people to be mobilized into the army. At the press conference, he said this was a serious number and that he would need to hear more arguments to support this direction. He said recruiting soldiers in those numbers would cost about $13.4 billion. The Ukrainian leader has called mobilization a highly sensitive issue and that the proposal will be discussed before Parliament considers it. He added that the military had to also address the issue of rotation and demobilizing soldiers. The number of Ukraine's troops are not publicized, and the number of losses are also kept secret. But U.S. officials estimate that hundreds of thousands of troops on both Ukrainian and Russian sides have been killed or wounded. At the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine saw tens of thousands of volunteer fighters take up arms. But after 2 years of war, the country is trying to recruit more men to replace those currently fighting at the front. Megumi Lim in Kyiv reporting for DD India.
Volodymyr Zelensky also said he was confident the US and the European Union would not betray his country by withholding crucial wartime funding as it fights off a Russian invasion.
We are working very hard on this, and I'm certain the United States of America will not betray us. And that on which we agreed in the United States will be fulfilled completely. Regarding the European Union, well, everyone played their big cards, and we reached one victory regarding the EU's 50 billion euros. I'm sure that we have already achieved all of this.
The Kremlin on Wednesday said there is currently no basis for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Britain had sunk chances of a peace deal in 2022 by pushing Kyiv to refuse a draft deal shortly after Russia sent troops into Ukraine. Peskov also condemned Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's proposed peace plan for excluding Russia. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are gearing up to celebrate their first Christmas on December 25th. Moving away from the usual norm of celebrating it on January 7th. Ukraine's main church agreed to move away from the Russian-observed Julian calendar this year, which celebrates Christmas in January. It's seen as a step away from Russian influence as Ukraine's military continues to fend off a Russian invasion. Chinese President Xi Jinping met visiting Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin in Beijing on Wednesday. The meeting comes against the backdrop of annual bilateral trade surpassing $200 billion for the first time this year. In a statement, the Chinese government stressed that maintaining close ties with Russia was a strategic choice. The leaders also signed agreements on customs, inspection and quarantine, and market supervision. China has said that rescue operations are almost over after an earthquake hit the nation on Tuesday, claiming at least 131 lives. Authorities are working towards providing medical help to the injured and focusing on resettlement. Disaster relief efforts have been challenging due to a powerful cold snap that gripped most of the nation last week. China has swiftly taken high-tech measures, including using military aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, and satellites for emergency rescue operations. The highest court in the U.S. state of Colorado has disqualified the country's former president, Donald Trump, from the state's ballot in next year's presidential elections. It took the decision because of Trump's alleged role in the attack on the U.S. legislature building in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021. The verdict applies only to the state of Colorado and to the primary elections to select a candidate for each party. But it has potentially set the stage for similar lawsuits to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. The ruling has made Trump the first presidential candidate in U.S. history to be deemed ineligible for the White House in a rarely used constitutional provision that bars anyone who has engaged in insurrection from holding office. The Trump campaign says it will challenge the ruling in the top U.S. court. That's it from me here in London. Back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Julia. Julia Chapman joining us from London. You're watching DD India Global, still to come on the show. Congo presidential hopeful Martin Fayulu has branded the country's election as total chaos amid allegations of fraud and electoral violence. India's total active COVID cases reached 2,300 with 21 cases of JN1 variant reported. WHO classifies the JN1 variant as a variant of interest, but with low risk. Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. On to the COVID-19 virus that continues to make its comeback. Thankfully, this time it is only a variant of interest with low risk, as declared by the World Health Organization. Nonetheless, the surge in cases of JN1 are making countries all over the world concerned. The Indian government today reviewed the preparedness of their public health system at a high-level meet in New Delhi. DD India's Mihir Mekhuri reports.
COVID-19 pandemic has once again returned across the globe. Though this variant JN1 is comparatively less risky, countries are battling the surge cautiously. India is all set to battle the new COVID cases. The country's health minister, Dr. Mansukh Mandavia, on Wednesday chaired a high-level meet to review the COVID-19 situation in India and preparedness of public healthcare system for surveillance, containment and management of COVID-19. In the meet, Indian states and union territories were advised to send samples of all COVID-19 positive cases to labs, plan appropriate public healthcare response. States were also advised to monitor emerging evidences of COVID-19 cases, symptoms and case severity. Mock drills to be undertaken every 3 months at both the central and state levels. Strengthen the surveillance systems for whole genome sequencing of positive case samples. Ramp up testing. Remain alert. Increase surveillance. Ensure adequate stock of medicines, oxygen cylinders, concentrators, ventilators and vaccines. Raise awareness among people on respiratory hygiene. Dissemination of factually correct information, counter fake news to mitigate any panic, and share information on cases, tests and positivity in real time.
It is not serious by itself. WHO has named it as a variant of interest. That means we watch it carefully. We keep on tracking this, keep on understanding its structure and so on. This variant has been present in 36 to 40 other countries, originally reported in Europe way back in August. So it's under watch. We are tracking the virus carefully. The JN.1 confirmed in Kerala in one case and 21 other cases in Goa are being tracked. So this virus subvariant is there in our country, and this is the same virus, as I said, which is driving upsurge in other countries. But we don't have to worry.
Now let's understand what exactly is the new COVID subvariant. JN1, COVID subvariant initially identified in Luxembourg, is a descendant of the Pyrola variant. It has its origins in the Omicron subvariant. World Health Organization has classified JN1 coronavirus strain as a variant of interest. World Health Organization has also said that the current evidence shows risk to public health was low from the strain. The common symptoms of JN1 subvariant are cough, cold, throat pain, headache, loose motions and mild breathlessness. Subvariant JN1 has already gripped few countries across the world such as China, Brazil, Germany and the United States. Preventive measures like frequent hand sanitization, use of triple mask and social distancing can help us in dealing with it efficiently. Mihir Mekhuri reporting for DD India.
And in Singapore, COVID-19 cases continue to rise. On 15th of December, an estimated number of COVID-19 cases increased there to 56,043. Between the time period of 3rd to 9th of December, this was a whopping 75% jump compared with 32,035 cases in the previous week. Shifting attention to India now, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has responded to allegations of an Indian assassination plot in the United States, saying that he will look into evidence, but diplomatic ties between India and the United States would not be derailed by few incidents. In an interview to the Financial Times newspaper published from the UK, Prime Minister Modi said, and I quote him, "We need to accept the fact that we are living in the era of multilateralism and the world is interconnected as well as interdependent. This reality compels us to recognize that absolute agreement on all matters cannot be a prerequisite for collaboration." Noting that India was deeply concerned about the activities of certain extremist groups based overseas, the Prime Minister said these elements, under the guise of freedom of expression, have engaged in intimidation and incited violence, unquote. And next we take a look at what else is happening around the world. Kuwait's new Emir, Sheikh Mishal Al-Ahmad Al-Sabah, has been formally sworn in as the new Emir. He took the oath of office during a special session of the National Assembly this morning. Presidential election is underway in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Voters in Congo's eastern city of Goma cast their ballots early on Wednesday. About 44 million Congolese are registered to take part in the presidential, legislative and regional vote. Hundreds of residents in South Africa's Cape Town ushered in the festive season with joyful melodies. The crowd belted out and sung carols as they welcomed the Christmas season. The event was aimed to bring hope to the hurting world and give people rest from a long year. As freezing cold weather continues to lash Russia, the demands of valenke, thick woolen boots traditionally worn by the Russians, are back in demand. Valenke holds a special position in Russian culture as they protect the wearers against the extreme cold weather and are made of 100% natural materials. Now, India's campaign, Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra, is being undertaken across the country with the aim to attain saturation of flagship schemes of the Government of India through ensuring that the benefits of these schemes reach all targeted beneficiaries in a time-bound manner. In this series, the outreach initiative, Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra, reached the panchayats of Rajouri, Derail and Manjakot blocks of border district Rajouri in Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. The initiative has achieved remarkable success in implementing various districts, in implementing various government schemes in Rajouri district. So this is part of the government's flagship program, campaign outreach program, Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra, and these visuals coming from Rajouri district of the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir. The United Service Institution, USI, one of the premier think tanks of India, today held the Marshal of Air Force Arjun Singh Memorial Lecture today in Delhi. The former Indian Air Force Chief, Air Chief Marshal R.K. Bhaduria, delivered the lecture and pointed out Marshal of the Air Force Arjun Singh's vision and foresight for innovation and self-reliance.
The sense of innovation, the sense of self-belief, that was an era, apart from the kind of modernization and expansion of the Air Force that was being thought of and transitioning from tactical to the strategic thought. It was also an era where Air Force converted Liberator aircraft from junkyards into flying machines and formed the first bomber squadron. It was also an era that Air Force, along with the industry and participation, developed the very first fighter aircraft in the Indian skies, the HF-24, which first flew in 1961 and was inducted within 6 years in 1967 in the Indian Air Force. So it was an era in belief in the industry.
And as we wrap up this edition of DD India Global, we leave you with glimpses of the Christmas festivities in Norway as the city dazzles up with beautiful lights ahead of Christmas. That's it in DD India Global today. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thank you for watching.